And so the very last part of our puzzle here is now that we've got organic molecules and they've come together to form macromolecules, how do we actually then package them so that they form the first cells? Because if you remember the cell theory, all cells had to arise from pre-existing cells, so in this case we're sort of violating the rules. The first cells had to come from something other than cells. We call them protobionts, hard word there, Protobionts. And these are basically the precursors to the first cells, and we're going to assume that the first cells were probably prokaryotes, because those were much easier than eukaryotes. And how could that have happened? Well, here's how it happens. If you just take proteins and just throw them into water, they tend to kind of bead up a little bit into droplets, because proteins tend to be difficult to dissolve. And those droplets we call microspheres, so that's kind of a model for what the first cells might be. Another way it could have happened was if you take lipids, so if you just take a couple of drops of oil and you kind of shake it in water, it comes together, and we saw in unit topic 3 that a bilayer of lipids, in that case phospholipids, would form. And so you'd get an inner environment and then the outer water environment. And when lipids come together like this, we call them coacervates. So these are two very primitive ways that cells could come together, and we can see this obviously when we throw proteins and lipids into water. This work was done originally by a Russian biologist named Oparin, O-P-A-R-I-N. And Oparin's theory basically is this, that living cells can actually form spontaneously from organic molecules simply because many organic molecules have hydrophobic features, that is, they don't like water, so when you throw them into water, and there's certainly a lot of water, they'll spontaneously come together to form the first protobionts, the first types of cells. So now, once Oparin has given us his theory, we have all the four pieces that we need to say that it's possible that life could have spontaneously happened on the planet Earth. So let's just quickly review them. This is abiotic synthesis of organic molecules. That is, organic molecules could have come from inorganic sources, and we saw that in the Urey-Miller experiment, where they took methane and water and ammonia and carbon monoxide and threw an electrical spark through them, and they got very primitive amino acids. We've seen polymer formation, that is, we saw simple amino acids come together to spontaneously form proteins, and they could have done that in hydrothermal vents or in volcanoes. We have seen now with Oparin's theory that proteins and lipids can come together spontaneously, self-assembly, into cellular entities, which we call protobiomes. And we also saw that the first molecule was probably RNA, since it was capable of self-replication. This doesn't mean that this is how it happened, but we've now given pieces of evidence to show that we've met our four conditions. Okay, now the environment, the atmosphere of the Earth, is starting to develop a little bit, and we're going from a reducing environment, that is, one without oxygen, to one which has oxygen. So originally we have a reducing environment. Now, about 450 million years ago, MYA, we assume that plants started to pop out. Now, how did this happen? Well, what we think was originally it was probably some sort of bacteria that came about. Remember, we said we've got the first type of cells, which are prokaryotes, and very primitive bacteria could be cyanobacteria. Now, these are bacteria which have the ability to do photosynthesis. So about 2.5 billion years ago, these guys start to make oxygen. So they were probably the precursors of plants because they could do photosynthesis. And they're replaced by archaeobacteria. Remember, we studied that in option F. And finally, these guys go on to evolve to be plants in 450 million years ago, and we start to get a lot of oxygen put out in the environment. Now, there's one more really interesting idea here, and for those of you who are not crazy about evolution, here is somebody who came along with a very different idea about how things may have progressed after we have an environment that starts to have oxygen and we start to get primitive cells. Her name is Lynn Margulis. She was actually the wife of Carl Sagan. She died a few years ago, and she came up with an idea called the endosymbiotic theory, which is now accepted by most biologists. And here's her basic idea. She says it's really interesting if you look at mitochondria and chloroplasts. So mitochondria we find in animal cells, chloroplasts we find in plant cells. They have a lot of things in common. For example, if you look down here at my evidence, right, they both have DNA. That's kind of bizarre, isn't it? We typically think of DNA as being in the nucleus, but there's actually DNA in mitochondria and chloroplasts. Why would they have DNA? Maybe it's because they came from somewhere else. Maybe they were alive at one point. And the DNA they have is not like ours. It's not chromosomes. It's circular and naked like bacteria would have. And they also have double membranes. Why would they have double membranes? Maybe it's because if they were alive, we engulfed them, and that's why there's two membranes. And they also have ribosomes, which are 70S. These are bacterial ribosomes. This is all very weird. And so she comes together with an interesting idea about how life could have got going. And here's her idea. She says, okay, we got primitive bacteria out there, and we got primitive eukaryotic cells. Maybe what happened is that a very primitive eukaryotic cell engulfed a bacteria. And instead of digesting it with all its little lysozymes, it actually incorporated that bacteria. Now, if a primitive eukaryotic cell had engulfed a cyanobacteria, which can do photosynthesis, that cyanobacteria eventually became a photosynthesis, and that eukaryotic cell eventually became a plant cell. But if that bacteria was an aerobic bacteria, that is one that could do cellular respiration, and it was eaten by a eukaryotic cell, then it might eventually become a mitochondria, because that's how animal cells can do cellular respiration. Now, her idea here is called endo because it's taking in, and symbiotic. Remember we talked about that word symbiosis, where two things work together so that everybody win-win. Now, in her theory, that would have been a real fast move ahead in the evolution of life forms to create plants and animals.